Imagine the year 1237. Snow falls silent on Russian villages. Children play near wooden huts. Fires glow inside homes. And then, the earth begins to shake. Hooves thunder across the frozen plains. The Mongols have arrived. They came like a storm out of the east. Swift, merciless, unstoppable. Cities like Ryazan and Kiev burned to the ground. Church bells silenced under clouds of smoke. Flames lit the night sky, turning snow into rivers of fire. People had never seen an army like this. Horse archers who could strike and vanish in a blink. Discipline so sharp, it crushed any defense. For Russia, it was not just war. It was the beginning of terror. The Mongols didn't just defeat armies. They broke spirits. They showed the Rus that no wall was high enough, no sword strong enough, no city safe enough. This was not the end of Russia, but it was the beginning of 2 centuries of darkness. The time that history remembers as the Mongol Yoke. For Russia, the Mongol invasion was not just a storm. It was the start of 2 centuries of darkness. A time history remembers as the Mongol Yoke. The year was 1240. The city of Kiev, the mother of Rus, stood proud on the banks of the Dnieper. Its golden domes shimmered in the winter sun. But that winter would be its last. The Mongols came like shadows. They surrounded the city. For days, they pounded the walls with fire and stone. And when the defenses broke, Kiev was erased. Homes burned. Churches looted. Thousands slaughtered in the streets. From that moment on, Russia lived under the will of the Khans. Princes who once fought for glory, now bowed like servants. Every year, they traveled east to the Mongol court. There, on their knees, they offered silver, gold, and gifts. They paid not just with treasure, but with loyalty. With silence, the Mongols demanded tribute from everyone. Peasants gave their grain. Merchants gave their profits. Even the church, once untouchable, paid its share. Those who refused? Entire villages burned as warning, and so fear became law. The word of the Khan was absolute. No sword could oppose it. No prayer could escape it. Every family in Russia lived with the same shadow. Work the fields, pay the tribute, and hope the Mongols never ride through your village. But the yoke was more than just payment. It was a chain around the Russian spirit. For 200 years, independence was crushed. Princes could not unite without Mongol approval. Wars were fought only when the Khans allowed. Even the strongest rulers lived in constant fear that one wrong step, one whispered rumor, could bring Mongol armies thundering back. Imagine growing up in this world. A child born in Novgorod or Moscow in the 1300s. You never knew freedom. You only knew the heavy hand of the horde. Your father pays the tax collector. Your mother whispers prayers that soldiers won't return. And you dream not of glory, but survival. The Mongol yoke turned Russia inward. Villages grew cautious, isolated, mistrustful. Princes plotted in secret, waiting for a chance to break free. But always the Mongol shadow loomed above them. And yet, in the silence, something else began to stir. Hidden inside this suffering was a lesson about patience, a lesson about power. The Mongols had crushed Russia's independence, yes, but they had also shown the Russians how empires were built, how taxes could bind people, how fear could control them, and how unity someday could break the chains. 2 centuries of tribute, 2 centuries of silence, 2 centuries of survival. This was the Mongol yoke, and when it finally broke, Russia would rise, stronger than ever before. Life in Russia under Mongol rule was not lived. It was endured. For the peasant, each season began the same way. Plow the fields, harvest the grain, count the livestock, and wait for the tax collector. Silver, grain, cattle, nothing was safe. The Mongols demanded tribute in all forms, and their envoys carried tall staffs, symbols of the Khan's authority. When they arrived, there was no debate. Every family handed over what they had, or watched soldiers take it by force. The people whispered, better to starve than to anger the Khan. Even the prince's men, once proud and free, bowed their heads. In Moscow, in Tver, in Novgorod, they traveled east to the horde's great camp. There, before Mongol envoys, they knelt in the dirt. They kissed the seal of the Khan. They begged for the right to rule their own lands. Imagine the humiliation. A Russian prince, descended from warriors, kneeling like a servant, waiting for permission, just to wear his own crown. The Mongols had broken more than walls. They had broken pride. For the common man, survival was the only dream. The weight of oppression lay heavy on every household. Work was for tribute. Prayer was for mercy. Freedom? It was only a story told by grandfathers. A faint memory of a time before the horde. Even festivals, once bright with laughter and songs, became shadows. Peasants sang quietly, fearing the sound might carry. Fires were dimmed, food rationed. Always the thought lingered, if the Mongols return, will we have enough to give? Over time, Mongol rule became a way of life. Children grew up knowing nothing else. They learned early, do not question the Khan, do not resist the tribute, do not dream too loudly. Yet, beneath the silence, resentment simmered. Priests whispered of God's justice. Merchants plotted ways to hide their wealth. Princes dreamed of the day they would no longer kneel, but that day was far away. For now, the Khan's shadow stretched over every village, every church, every road. From sunrise to sunset, life moved under its weight. A peasant sowing seed, a mother feeding her child, a priest ringing the church bell. All lived in quiet fear. And still, the tribute wagons rolled eastward. Gold, silver, grain, cattle. Year after year, decade after decade, life under the Khan was not marked by great victories. It was marked by endurance, a slow, bitter survival. And in that survival, the Russian people learned patience. They learned to bend without breaking, to wait without surrender. For though Mongol rule seemed endless, deep inside, the fire of resistance still burned, silent, hidden, waiting. At first, Moscow was nothing, a small wooden town on the banks of a quiet river. Traders passed through. Farmers brought their grain. But no one imagined this place would one day become the heart of Russia. So how did Moscow rise? Not with armies, not with battles, but with patience and cunning. Its princes were clever men. They looked at rivals like Tver and Novgorod, richer, older, more powerful. And they did not attack them with swords. They outsmarted them. Moscow's rulers learned to play the Mongols' game. Where other princes resisted the horde and were crushed, Moscow bowed strategically. They paid tribute faithfully. They earned the Khan's trust. And slowly, very slowly, Moscow became the favorite. The Khan needed loyal servants. Moscow gave him exactly that. When the Mongols wanted taxes collected, Moscow stepped forward. When disputes arose among Russian princes, Moscow offered to settle them, always in its own favor, and the rewards came. The Khan granted Moscow special privileges, more land, more power, more authority over rivals. It was a dangerous strategy. To some, Moscow looked like a traitor servant of the horde, but behind the loyalty, something deeper was taking shape. A plan. With every coin collected, Moscow grew richer. With every favor earned, Moscow grew stronger. And with every rival defeated, Moscow grew bolder. The wooden walls of the town became stone. Churches rose high above the streets. Merchants crowded its markets. and people from villages nearby began to move there, drawn by the promise of safety. Slowly, the center of Russia began to shift. No longer Tver, no longer Novgorod. The beating heart was moving to Moscow. But this rise was not just about wealth. It was about faith. The Russian Orthodox Church saw in Moscow a protector. When enemies threatened, Moscow shielded the priests, guarded the icons, rebuilt the churches. And so the blessing of God seemed to rest on the city. By the 14th century, Moscow was more than a town. It was a symbol of survival, of unity, of hope. Rival cities tried to stop it. They plotted, they fought, they schemed. But Moscow's princes always found a way to turn defeat into advantage. Always one step ahead, the people began to whisper, "Moscow is different. Moscow will lead us." And they were right. From this once small, quiet trading post, a power was rising. A power that would outlast the Mongols. A power that would forge an empire. The rise of Moscow was slow, patient, and hidden behind masks of loyalty. But when the time came, it would reveal its true face, not as servant of the Khan, but as the future ruler of Russia. His name was Ivan Danilovich, but history remembers him by another name, Ivan Kalita, Ivan Moneybag. Why? Because in an age of swords and fire, he discovered that gold could be a sharper weapon. When the Mongols ruled Russia, they demanded tribute, silver, grain, furs. Year after year, the burden crushed the people. And it was Ivan who stepped forward as the Khan's trusted collector. While other princes hesitated, Ivan bowed low. He promised the horde loyalty. He promised the tribute would arrive on time. And he kept his word. The Mongols rewarded him. They gave him authority. They gave him protection. They made Moscow their favorite. At first, people saw only a servant of the Khan, a man enriching himself while others suffered. But Ivan was playing a deeper game. As tribute flowed through his hands, he did not waste it. He saved it. He used it. Every coin became a stone, a weapon, a tool. He bought land piece by piece, village by village. Where rivals were selling their estates to survive, Ivan was buying. Where famine struck, Ivan stepped in with silver. When boyars needed loans, Ivan gave them, but at a cost. Slowly, their lands, their loyalties, their power slipped into his hands. Moscow grew richer. Moscow grew larger. And Ivan earned his name, Moneybag. But Ivan was not only a collector of silver. He was a collector of faith. The Russian Orthodox Church, weakened and harassed, needed safety. Ivan offered it. He persuaded the metropolitan of the church to move his seat to Moscow. And with the priests came prestige, blessings, a sense that Moscow was chosen by God himself. So while others cursed him for serving the Mongols, Ivan was laying foundations. Foundations of land. Foundations of faith. Foundations of power. His rivals in Tver and Novgorod still dreamed of greatness. But Ivan's wealth outshone their armies. He used silver where they used swords. And in the end, it was silver that won. By the time Ivan died, Moscow was no longer just another Russian city. It was the center, the strongest, richest, and most secure. And behind it all was one man, a man who never raised a mighty army, but built a kingdom out of coins. Ivan Moneybag, the prince who turned tribute into power and set Moscow on the road to empire. It was the year 1380. For more than a century, Russia had lived under the shadow of the Mongols. Princes bowed, peasants paid tribute. The Khan's will was law. But in Moscow, a young prince named Dmitry Ivanovich was growing restless. History would call him Dmitry Donskoy, Dmitry of the Don, the man who dared to say, "Enough. The Mongols were not as strong as they once had been. Their empire stretched thin, torn by rival khans. Yet their names still carried fear. Most Russian princes preferred silence, submission, survival, but Dmitry had a vision. A Russia united, not divided by rival cities, not broken by tribute, but standing together. So he sent out his call. He rallied princes under Moscow's banner. And for the first time in generations, Russian swords were lifted not against each other, but against the horde. The meeting place was the Don River on the wide, grassy plain of Kulikovo. Here, in the open fields, the fate of Russia would be tested. The Mongol army came under Mamai, a powerful warlord. Their banners filled the horizon. Their horsemen darkened the steppe. To the Russians, it seemed like a sea of iron and fire. Dmitry stood among his warriors, farmers, townsmen, knights in heavy armor. He wore no crown, no golden robes. Instead, he dressed as a common soldier, to fight and bleed with his men. That act alone gave them courage. The battle began with a thunder of hooves. Mongol arrows darkened the sky. Russian shields trembled. The plain became a storm of steel and cries. Hour after hour, the fight raged. Lines broke, reformed, broke again. The Mongols pressed hard. But Dmitry's men did not give way. And then, at the critical moment, Dmitry revealed his final card. A hidden regiment, kept in reserve, charged from the woods. The Russians struck with fury. The Mongols wavered. Then they broke. The field of Kulikovo was won. For the first time, a Russian army had stood against the Mongols and triumphed. The victory did not end the Mongol yoke. The horde would return. Moscow itself would be burned again. But something deeper had changed out at Kulikovo. Russia had discovered its strength. A seed of unity had been planted. A pride that no tribute could crush. A belief that one day the Mongols would be cast off forever. And at the heart of that day stood Dmitry Donskoy, the prince who showed his people that the horde could bleed, that Russia could rise, that the road to freedom had begun. The victory at Kulikovo had shaken the world. For the first time, Russian warriors had stood against the Mongol horde and won. Songs were sung. Hopes began to rise. Perhaps the long night of submission was finally ending, but the Mongols were not finished. They were wounded, not broken. And the horde never forgot an insult. 2 years later, in 1382, the storm returned. This time, under a new leader, Toktamish, the Khan of the Golden Horde. He came with fire in his eyes and vengeance in his heart. The horde swept across the Russian lands like a tide of iron. Villages were trampled. Towns burned. Terror spread faster than any army dot, and then the horde stood before the walls of Moscow. The city Dmitry had built as the heart of resistance. The city that had dared to defy them at Kulikovo. At first, the people believed the walls would hold. They had survived before. They prayed, they waited, they clung to hope. But treachery opened the gates. Promises of mercy lured defenders into surrender. And when the Mongols entered, mercy vanished. The streets of Moscow ran red. Thousands were cut down where they stood. Fires rose higher than the walls themselves. Houses, churches, markets all swallowed by flames. For 3 days, the city screamed. And when the smoke cleared, Moscow lay in ruins. Ashes where homes had stood. Silence where bells once rang dot. It was a warning to all of Russia. Defy the Khan, and this is your fate. And yet, even in ruin, something survived. The spirit of Kulikovo did not die with the flames. The people remembered that they had once stood together, that the horde could be resisted. That freedom, though distant, was not impossible. Dmitry returned to a city of ashes. But in his heart, he carried something the Mongols could not burn: hope. A fire that lived not in wood or stone, but in the will of his people. The Mongols had struck back with terror. But terror could not erase the memory of courage. Moscow would rise again, and with it, the dream of a Russia free from the horde. The ashes of 1382 were not the end. They were the beginning of a new resolve, a promise that someday the yoke would be broken forever. From the ashes of Mongol rule, a new leader rose, Ivan III of Moscow. History would remember him as Ivan the Great. He was not a man of half measures, patient when he had to be, ruthless when the moment demanded. And his vision was clear. Moscow would no longer kneel. For centuries, Russian princes had carried the Khan's tribute. Silver, furs, grain all hauled east in wagons of submission, each payment a reminder of chains that bound the land. But Ivan had grown tired of chains. He dreamed of something greater. A Russia united. A Russia free. Step by step, Ivan built his power. He used marriage, alliances, and cunning deals to expand Moscow's lands. Through diplomacy, he outplayed rivals. Through war, he crushed those who stood in his way. One by one, the cities of Rus bowed not to the Mongols, but to Moscow. And then came the turning point. In 1480, Ivan faced the horde on the banks of the Ugra River. The standoff lasted for weeks. Russian soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder. The Mongol army glared back across the water. No arrows flew. No swords clashed. But in that silence, something extraordinary happened. The Mongols turned away. And with that retreat, the tribute ended. The yoke was broken. Russia was free. Ivan knew freedom was not just won on battlefields. It had to be seen. In the heart of Moscow, he ordered the building of a fortress unlike any other. The Kremlin. Stone walls. Golden domes. A city within a city. A symbol that Moscow was not only powerful, it was eternal. And in those walls lived his vision. Not a scattered land of princes, owing to foreign masters, but one Russia, strong, proud, and united under a single ruler. Even the Great was not perfect. He could be harsh. He could be cold. But he was the man who stood where others had bowed. The man who told the Mongols, no more. When the bells of the Kremlin rang, they did not ring for the Khan. They rang for Moscow. They rang for Russia. And from that moment forward, every Tsar who followed walked in the shadow of Ivan's dream. The dream of a Russia that would never again kneel. 1453. The world changed forever. For more than 1,000 years, Constantinople had stood as the jewel of the Byzantine Empire. Golden domes glimmered in the sun. Its walls, thick and towering, had defied countless invaders. It was the last guardian of the Christian East. But then came the Ottomans. Cannons thundered against ancient stone. The city shook under the weight of iron balls never seen before in warfare. For weeks, the defenders held on. Priests carried icons through the streets. The people prayed for a miracle, but no miracle came. The walls crumbled. The Ottomans poured in. Byzantium was gone. The Second Rome had fallen. Across Europe, shock spread like wildfire. And in Moscow, the meaning was clear. If Constantinople was no more, then who would protect the true Christian faith? Who would guard the Orthodox Church? The answer, whispered in the churches of Moscow, was bold and dangerous. Moscow would rise as the Third Rome. No longer just a city of merchants and princes. Moscow was chosen by God. The torch of Byzantium had passed to Russia. The Russian Church grew in power and importance. Priests spoke of a sacred mission, to defend the faith, to lead the Orthodox world, to carry on the empire that had died with Constantinople. And even the third, ruler of Moscow, embraced this destiny. He married Sophia Palaiologina, the niece of Byzantium's last emperor. With her came the double-headed eagle, the symbol of imperial power. Moscow now wore it proudly as its own. It was more than marriage. It was a claim that Russia was heir to Rome, that Moscow was the new center of Christendom, that the future of the Orthodox faith now rested not in the ruins of Byzantium, but in the Kremlin's golden domes. The people believed it. The Church proclaimed it, and the rulers of Moscow carried it forward with iron will. From that moment, Russia was not just fighting for land or power. It was fighting for a divine purpose, to protect the faith, to shield Christendom from its enemies, to fulfill the destiny of the Third Rome. The fall of Constantinople had seemed like the end, but in Moscow it became the beginning of something new, a vision that would shape centuries of Russian history, a vision of empire, a vision of faith and power bound together. The old Rome had fallen. The second Rome had burned, but the third Rome would endure, and in its shadow Russia would rise. The year was 1547. Inside the great cathedral of the Dormition in Moscow, a boy of just 16 walked forward. His name was Ivan. The world would soon know him as Ivan the Terrible. But on that day, he was not just a prince, not just a ruler of Moscow. He was crowned with a new title, Tsar of all Russia. For the first time, Russia had a single, absolute ruler, a Tsar, a title that carried the weight of Caesar, of Rome itself. Ivan declared himself not merely a king, but a chosen ruler of God. The boyars, the noble families who had fought and schemed for centuries, were stunned. For generations, they had pulled the strings behind the throne, playing princes against each other. But Ivan's coronation ended their games. He was no puppet. He was master, and he made sure everyone knew it. The Church blessed his rule, calling him divinely appointed. The people, weary of endless struggles between nobles, looked to him as a savior. In Ivan, they saw strength. They saw order. They saw a leader who would unite the land under one crown. From that moment, Russia changed forever. No longer a patchwork of rival cities and noble families. It was one state, one faith, one ruler. But Ivan's rise was not only about titles and ceremonies. It was about power. And power, once taken, must be kept. He began to strip the boyars of their independence. He filled his court with loyal servants, men who owed their position not to birth, but to his favor. Every act reminded Russia of one truth. There was no power above the Tsar. Ivan believed himself chosen by God to rule with absolute authority. And in that belief, mercy had little place. Loyalty was rewarded. Defiance was crushed not yet in those early years. Hope still burned. Ivan spoke of justice, of reform, of building a Russia that was strong, united, and blessed by heaven. He reorganized the government. He called councils to bring order. He strengthened the army to protect his growing realm. The people dreamed of a new golden age, an age where Russia would stand tall among the nations of the world. And for a time, it seemed possible. The young Tsar, crowned in glory, promised not just power but destiny. He was not merely Ivan of Moscow anymore. He was Ivan, Tsar of all Russia. And with him, a new age of autocracy had begun. What no one knew then was how that power would twist. How the boy crowned in splendor would become a ruler feared above all others. The crown had made him great, but it would also make him terrible. The crown gave Ivan power, but power alone was not enough. To hold Russia together, to keep his throne secure, he needed more than fear. He needed a system, a state built in his image. And so Ivan began to reform Russia. The old chaotic rule of boyars was swept aside. No longer would noble families run their lands as private kingdoms. From Moscow, Ivan created a centralized government. Officials answered not to the boyars, but to the Tsar. Orders flowed downward, loyalty flowed upward. At last, Russia had a single center of power, But government alone could not defend the realm. For centuries, Russia had suffered raids and invasions. Enemies pressed from east, west, and south. Ivan knew that if Russia was to survive, it needed an army worthy of its Tsar, so he built one. Not a feudal levy of knights and peasants, but a modern force. Soldiers armed with muskets, cannons, and steel. The Streltsy Moscow's new standing troops marched in uniform ranks, loyal to the Tsar alone. Fortresses rose on Russia's borders. Guns thundered where once only arrows had flown. The age of medieval war was ending. Ivan made sure Russia would not be left behind, yet power must be justified, not only enforced. And here, the Church was Ivan's greatest ally. The Russian Orthodox Church declared his coronation divine. Priests preached that the Tsar was chosen by God himself to rule the faithful. Moscow was not just a capital now, it was the third Rome, the holy defender of Christendom after Constantinople's fall. By embracing the Church, Ivan gave his rule sacred weight. To disobey the Tsar was not only treason, it was sin. With cross and crown united, his throne stood unshakable. All these reforms built more than a state. They built an idea that Russia was not simply a land of many peoples, but one nation under one ruler. That the Tsar's word was law, his authority absolute. This was the foundation of Tsarist Russia. A system where the ruler held both sword and scepter, where church and state marched side by side, where armies stood ready to defend not just territory, but the destiny of a nation. For the people, it was a time of hope. The land was expanding, the state was strong, the faith was secure. They believed the Tsar would lead them into greatness. But beneath the order, shadows lingered. Centralization meant control. Control meant suspicion. And suspicion, in the hands of a ruler like Ivan, would one day lead to terror. For now, though, the dream lived. A Russia united, armed, and blessed. A Tsar chosen by God, and the rise of a state that would endure for centuries. The Tsar had reformed his state. He had built his armies. Now, Ivan turned his eyes outward. For centuries, Russia had lived in the shadow of the Mongols. Even after Moscow's independence, remnants of their empire still ruled powerful khanates on Russia's borders. To the east, Kazan. To the south, Astrakhan. Lands rich in trade, guarded by warriors, and ruled by Muslim untold to secure Russia's future. Ivan knew they must fall. In 1552, he marched against Kazan. It was no ordinary campaign. This was a holy war, blessed by the Church, to break the last chains of the Tatar yoke. Ivan's armies came not only with swords, but with something new: siege artillery. Massive cannons roared against Kazan's walls, shaking the city to its core. The battle raged for days. Fire, smoke, and blood filled the air. At last, the walls fell. Russian troops stormed the city, and Kazan was taken. The victory was more than military, it was spiritual. For the first time, Russia had conquered, not just defended. The Tsar stood triumphant as conqueror. 2 years later, Ivan struck again. This time at Astrakhan, the gateway to the Caspian Sea. The fortress crumbled before Russia's might. The Khanate was absorbed, its trade routes now flowing to Moscow. The dream of a united, expanding Russia was becoming reality. No longer a land pressed down by foreign rule, Russia was rising as a power of its own. But Ivan did not stop there. He sent explorers and Cossacks farther east, across the wild rivers and endless forests of Siberia. Step by step, village by village, they claimed new lands for the Tsar. A new frontier had opened, one that would one day stretch to the Pacific. In just a few short years, Ivan had transformed Russia. He was no longer simply the first crowned Tsar. He was the maker of an empire, but conquest came at a price. Wars drained the treasury. Battles bled his people, and with each victory, Ivan's hunger for power only grew. Russia had begun its march to greatness. But within the Tsar himself, darker storms were gathering. Ivan was not content with ruling Moscow alone. He dreamed of an empire vast, unshakable, and feared. And so the Tsar turned toward. First came Kazan, a proud Tatar Khanate, heir to the Mongol steppe. Its walls rose strong, its warriors fierce. But Ivan came with something new: cannons, siege towers, disciplined troops. The year was 1552. Russian guns thundered, shaking the city. For days, Kazan burned under relentless fire. And then the walls broke. Ivan's soldiers poured in. The Khanate was crushed, and its lands became Russia's. It was more than victory. It was revenge. A final blow against the Mongol shadow that had haunted Russia for 2 centuries. 2 years later, the Tsar struck again. This time at Astrakhan, the fortress of the lower Volga. Control of Astrakhan meant control of the Caspian trade. Silk, spices, silver, now they flowed to Moscow. The Khanate fell, its banners lowered, its rivers turned Russian. With Kazan and Astrakhan gone, the steppe lay open. Cossacks and pioneers pushed east, across forests, rivers, and mountains. Siberia endless, wild, untamed. For the first time, Russian banners flew beyond the Urals. A new frontier had opened, a road that would one day stretch to the Pacific Ocean. But Ivan's eyes did not look only east. He turned west as well. There, the Livonian Order stood guard German knights ruling lands along the Baltic. If Russia could break them, it would gain the sea, and with it, trade with Europe. In 1558, the Livonian War began. At first, Russian armies stormed fortresses and seized towns. It seemed the Baltic might fall. But powerful enemies soon gathered: Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden. The war dragged on, draining men and money. Victories turned to stalemates, and stalemates to defeats. The dream of a Baltic empire slipped through Ivan's hands. Still, even with setbacks in the west, Russia had grown. From a land of scattered princes, it had become a state that stretched across continents. Kazan taken, Astrakhan seized, Siberia opened. The map of Russia was forever changed. Ivan the Terrible had forged more than just victories. He had forged an empire. But empires come with a cost. And for Ivan, the weight of power began to twist into suspicion, anger, and fear. The wars had made Russia strong. Yet soon, the Tsar's darkest battles would not be fought against foreign enemies, but against his own people. At first, Ivan was a ruler with vision, a builder of armies, a breaker of khanates, a Tsar who dreamed of empire. But as the years passed, something dark began to grow inside him. Paranoia, fear, suspicion of everyone around him. He trusted no boyar, no general, no friend. He saw betrayal in every whisper, treason in every shadow. The Tsar, who once united Russia, now turned his fury inward. Black riders of the Apriknina roamed the streets. Clad in dark cloaks, they carried severed dog heads as symbols of their hunt. Neighbors accused neighbors. Families disappeared overnight. Terror became the language of power. But Ivan's cruelty did not stop with nobles. It reached the very walls of his own palace. His temper burned hot like wildfire, uncontrollable and merciless. Servants feared his gaze. Advisors dared not speak. Even those closest to him were never safe. Then came the most terrible moment of all. In a fit of rage, Ivan struck his own son, the heir to the throne, the one who was meant to carry Russia's crown. The blow was fatal. The young Tsarevich crumpled, blood spilling across the floor. Silence. The Tsar froze, staring at what he had done. He had killed not just his son. But Russia's future from that day forward, even was never the same. Haunted by guilt, yet driven deeper into madness. The court grew quiet, suffocated by fear. The people suffered as taxes rose, wars dragged on, and villages burned. The once proud Tsar had become a tyrant, a man consumed by his own demons. Under his rule, Russia expanded in size, but shrank in spirit. The land groaned under his cruelty. The people whispered of a ruler chosen by God, yet cursed by his own hand. The legacy of Ivan the Terrible was no longer just empire and conquest. It was a legacy of blood, grief, and madness. And as the Tsar aged, Russia stood at a crossroads. Would the nation survive the shadow of its own ruler? Or would the madness of one man drag it into ruin? Russia's story began in chains. The Mongols came like a storm, burning cities, crushing princes, forcing every hand to bow. For 2 centuries, the land lived in fear. But from that darkness, Moscow rose. A small trading town turned into the beating heart of a nation. Clever rulers played the Mongols at their own game. Silver, land, and faith flowed into Moscow's hands. Even Moneybag built wealth. Dmitry Donskoy raised his banner at Kulikovo, showing that Russians could stand against the Khan. Even the great broke the tribute chains, declaring freedom from foreign rule. And with the fall of Constantinople, Moscow claimed the destiny of a third Rome, a new guardian of the Christian world. Then came Ivan the Terrible, the first crowned Tsar, a man of vision and terror. He built armies, crushed khanates, and stretched Russia's borders to the edge of Siberia. But he also filled the land with fear. His black riders spread death. His rage even killed his own son. Under him, Russia gained empire, but at the price of blood and sorrow. By the time Ivan's reign ended, Russia was no longer a land of broken princes. It was a state centralized, powerful, feared by neighbors. An empire forged not in peace, but in fire and ambition. The Mongols had tried to chain Russia. Instead, their grip created something far greater. A people hardened by struggle. A city Moscow that refused to die. And a throne that claimed God's will as its crown. The scars of the past never faded. Fear of tyranny. Dreams of empire. Faith as both weapon and shield. These became part of Russia's soul. The story of medieval Russia is not one of gentle progress. It is a story of storms, of rulers with iron fists, of faith that outlasted fire, and ambition that refused to bow from Mongol chains to Tsarist empire. Russia was forever shaped by fire and blood. And that legacy still echoes today.